In this video, we'll be going through the anatomy of the female reproductive system. This is found in your notebook on page 216 and also in the Google Classroom. You may also want to refer to the diagrams that you should have already labeled, which are on page 299 and 300 of your notebook. So jumping right in, the first thing that we're going to talk about are the ovaries. Those are the female gonads. Just like the male testes, they have an exocrine and an endocrine function. The exocrine function is going to be that production of the ova or the eggs, and we're going to get back to that in a moment. And that is going to work its way into a series of tubing. So that's going to be the fallopian tube. And that's what makes it exocrine, the fact that it is in some tubing. The endocrine function is the production of hormones, which is absorbed directly into the blood. That is the estrogen and the progesterone. The size of an ovary is about the size and shape of an almond. So just looking at the general layout here, we're going to have an ovary. There's going to be a gap between them. There's going to be a funnel-shaped end called an infundibulum. These little ends here, our finger-like projection, are going to be fimbriae. And then we're going to have that fallopian tube. So the egg is going to be ovulated. It's going to have to come into this funnel, work its way down the fallopian tube into the central area, which is the uterus. We're going to learn some of its parts. And then it's going to implant potentially in the wall of the uterus. We also have the cervix, which is a barrier between the uterus and the vagina. And then the vagina, it leaves the body. So here's an ovary. Here are some ligaments sort of anchoring that in place. Here from a rabbit, we've got a picture of an ovary, the uterus, a fallopian tube. So looking at the ovary, this is going to become very important in the next set of notes, which is on function, which really is going to deal with the development of the eggs. And we're going to cover that here as well, because it is a difficult topic for some people. So ovarian follicles are tiny sac-like structures that are inside the ovary, and they house the immature eggs, which are going to be the oocytes. So follicle cells are the layers that surround the oocyte. And what we can see here is a bunch of little tiny primordial follicles. And then we have a primary follicle, and what they're showing is this development of it to the point where it eventually is released from the egg there at the bottom. So here again, we see right here, this would be ovulation. And so looking at it here, we have an entire ovary. They've cut it open, and they're just showing one primary oocyte developing and going through the stages. So just as an overview here, we see this thing growing, developing, changing shape. We notice here that the oocyte is in the center of the follicle. As it nears the end, it's off to one side. Eventually, that's going to be released here. At that point, it's going to be a secondary oocyte. Back here, it's a primary one. So we have to talk about some changes it goes through to reach that point. Once it's released, there's a layer left behind. That becomes a new structure called the corpus luteum, and eventually the corpus luteum degrades and is reabsorbed by the body. The follicle, as it develops, is going to have a fluid-filled center called an antrum. And so the antrum fills up with this special fluid, and basically this is where the egg is beginning to mature. Another name for this at this stage is called a Graafian follicle. And another name for that would be a vesicular follicle. So you hear a few different names here. Sometimes it's called tertiary, meaning the third stage of development, Graafian, or vesicular. They're all the same thing, essentially. So the developing egg is ready to be ejected from the ovary, and when that happens, that's called ovulation. So just kind of looking at the parts here, this is going to be a vesicular follicle. In other words, this is along so that it's about ready to be ovulated. So right here, we have a layer of follicle cells that are called granulosa cells. There's another layer of cells here, which were originally granulosa cells. They're now referred to as cumulus cells. And then we have the oocyte itself. So really, in yellow here, they're showing you the oocyte. This is sort of the cell membrane. This area in here, that's going to be the nucleus of the oocyte. And then this is a layer of cells that are surrounding that. This is a larger layer of cells containing the whole thing. And then this is fluid in the middle. So the parts can be a little confusing if you're new to it, but they each play a role. Here's an actual stained picture. So what we can see here are some follicles that have not come to development yet. See how small they are in comparison. Here is a follicle that's just about ready to ovulate the secondary oocyte. So again, what do we have here? We've got those granulosa cells. Basically, this is a follicle. This is the fluid-filled antrum, building up a lot of pressure. Here's another layer of cells that are surrounding it. This is going to be called the corona radiata in this area. And then inside that, that's where we find this secondary oocyte that's getting ready to be released. Okay. Now, up here, these would be primary oocytes. They have not finished development yet. So ovulation is the release of a secondary oocyte from a follicle. Normally occurs once every 28 days. That's a generalization. We're going to talk about that more in physiology. In older women, the ovary has released many different secondary oocytes over the course of her life, and it actually is damaging the surface of that ovary, so it becomes pitted and scarred. So this is actually capturing the release through the surface. So this is the ovary. This is going to be a fluid-filled area outside of the ovary, and this is the release. Now that you've released that secondary oocyte, that's going to have to go on and get picked up by the fallopian tube, where it's going to travel down slowly to reach the uterus. In the meantime, back in the ovary, that ruptured follicle that was left behind becomes the corpus luteum. Corpus means body, luteum in this case refers to yellow, so it literally means yellow body, and that's what it looks like. So here we can see early on we have a growing follicle. We see the stage where it's developed an antrum and filled with fluid, grown in size. At this point, that's released. So in here there is the secondary oocyte and a protective layer of cells around it called the corona radiata. But this ruptured layer of cells is still inside the ovary. The fluid has been released. Now it closes back up. It transforms into a glandular structure called the corpus luteum. And then eventually that's going to degrade over time. We can see down here at the bottom there are 4 hormones that all synchronize in a certain pattern. That deal with this. So we're going to talk about follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone at a later time. They're going to become very important. And so here, just as the overview, so I guess we will cover it right now briefly. Here is an early follicle, probably has a primary oocyte in it. So right here, number 1 in green, that is going to be follicle stimulating hormone. As that increases in amount, that starts to trigger this development. Now, as these develop, these these granulosa cells actually start to produce estrogen. So number 2 is estrogen. So as the follicle develops, it gains the ability to produce estrogen. Estrogen's released, those amounts rise as well. So number 2 here is estrogen levels rising. While this has been happening, back in the pituitary, we have a buildup of luteinizing hormone. That gets released in a big surge. That is what triggers ovulation. So here we have the release of the oocyte. So this little part here is the nucleus. The gray circle is the actual secondary oocyte, and this layer around it is a layer of cells, which is the corona radiata. Behind, this is the ruptured layer of follicle cells that stays behind. That becomes the corpus luteum. It's now a gland, essentially, and it's releasing progesterone. So yellow here is progesterone. We have low levels of progesterone. Now that we have this gland here, those levels increase. As it decays and goes away, those levels drop off. And then we're going to have completed one full cycle. Here is, again, a cross-section of an ovary. So the outer layer is cortex, again, meaning bark. We saw that with the adrenal cortex, the renal cortex, the cerebral cortex in different organs earlier this year. Interior is the medulla. So in the cortex area, this usually has those primordial follicles in it. Now, what we see here is the development of a corpus luteum. So an egg has been ovulated, this is left behind, and this is all stained here. And this is an actual one, and you can see it's literally yellow. So this ovary has been cut in half, and we're looking at the corpus luteum here, which is kind of sticking out. The ovary itself is not just floating around. It is held in place by some ligaments. So these are called the suspensory ligaments, ovarian ligaments, and the broad ligament. And they sort of house and contain the ovaries to keep them in position. So here is the ovary. We've got some of those ligaments holding it in place. It's holding it near the end of the fallopian tube, which is leading to the uterus. And that funnel-shaped end is where that secondary oocyte needs to come up into. Okay. Does it sometimes not go in there? Yes, sometimes it doesn't, in which case it's not going to be able to be fertilized in here. Okay, so the body would just eventually destroy it, probably with macrophages. These two in the diagram are shown pretty far apart. In reality, they're closer together. So often when this is released, it's encapsulated. There's also a fluid current that's set up. It helps sweep it into here. So it actually does get in there pretty well. Now, in terms of the sets of tubing here, we've got the duct system. So we're working our way from inside to out because we're following the path of that secondary oocyte. So another name for the fallopian tube is uterine tubes, sometimes called oviducts. But again, that term is more often used in non-human animals. That leads to uterus and then to the vagina. So starting with the fallopian tubes, they're what receive that secondary oocyte. This is where fertilization is actually going to take place. So even though sperm are deposited in the vagina, they have to make their way through the cervix, up through the uterus, up through the fallopian tube, and then find that oocyte and fertilize it in the fallopian tube. That then will start to be, as a zygote or a fertilized egg, it's going to travel down the fallopian tube back into the uterus. And while that's happening, it's already beginning development. Those cells are undergoing mitosis and starting to divide. And we'll talk about that more in a later set of notes. The fallopian tube is about 4 inches long, and it's on the superior end of the uterus. And again, the fallopian tube isn't just wherever it wants to be. It's supported by the broad ligament. So here we have the ovary. That funnel-shaped end is sort of encapsulating part of it. There is a little gap here. There's fluid in the space. This end is called the infundibulum. These little finger-like projections are called fimbriae. They help sweep that secondary oocyte up into the fallopian tube, where it's going to start to travel down. Meanwhile, sperm is trying to work its way up, get into this area, fertilize it, and then lead to the uterus. So that infundibulum we keep mentioning is that funnel-shaped end of the uterine tube, or the fallopian tube, not quite in direct contact. And then the end of it has those projections, and they create a waving motion to create a fluid current, trying to sweep that oocyte into the tube, because unlike the sperm, it cannot swim. It does not have a flagella, doesn't have the means to do that. The fluid current has to carry it into this area, and then peristalsis is going to take it down. So we have an ovary here, and here we have the fimbriae This whole area is an infundibulum, and we don't really see the fallopian tube in this view. So how does it move down that tube? Peristalsis, and that tube is also lined with cilia. Takes 3 to 4 days to actually make that trip from the time it was ovulated and taken up by the tube to make it to the uterus. Therefore, there's a concern here, and that is that oocytes are actually viable for about 24 hours after they're released. And so that's why fertilization has to take place in the tube. That sperm doesn't make it there, then this egg could go to the uterus but be unfertilized. So now the uterus is a hollow organ about the size of a pear in a woman who has not previously been pregnant. And what it's going to do is receive, retain, and nourish that fertilized egg. It needs to implant in the wall of this organ. The uterus is between the urinary bladder, which is to the front, and the rectum, or end of the large intestine, which is more posterior. Okay, so as that, if that woman becomes pregnant, it is going to grow. So that uterus increases in size. It can actually be felt above, in a lot of cases, the height of the umbilicus, meaning the belly button. And this is an actual uterus, and it's been cut open. There's no baby in it. It's already been removed. This is the end of a C-section. They're then going to need to put everything back in place and finish the surgery. Sometimes we think of a C-section, they just say, "Oh, we're just going to cut the baby out." It's actually a very invasive surgery. So there definitely has a place and time, but it is not just a simple matter of just saying, "Oh, we just cut the belly open and we take out the baby." It is major surgery. So some of the attachments we've already mentioned are these ligaments, and these attach to the uterus as well. Parts of the uterus include the body, the fundus, and the cervix. Some of these terms might look familiar. We saw the term body and fundus with the stomach. Okay, so they're not unique to the uterus, but we also use these terms for the uterus. So just kind of looking at it here, this whole structure here is the uterus, and there's a thickness to it. So this thick area here is the middle layer. We see they've colored this lining for us. That's the inner layer. And then it has an outer layer. So we've seen this pattern all year. There's usually an outer, middle, and inner layer. So the inner layer is going to be the endometrium for being inside. Myo means muscular. So this muscular layer here is the myometrium. Okay, this area up here that's rounded is what they refer to as the fundus. The whole thing is basically the body. And then the end, the barrier before it reaches the vagina, is the cervix. And then we see that that's our pathway again. So layers of the uterine wall. Endometrium is where the egg, if it's fertilized, is going to implant. It grows tissue each month. And this is the lining that can go into spasms, break down, and detach and become the menses, or the tissue that's leaving the body when we're completing one of the cycles of the period. So myometrium is the middle layer. It's muscular, and that muscle is smooth muscle. And so when we talk about delivering the baby, it plays a role in doing that, a very active role. And then the outer layer is perimetrium, which would also be considered the visceral layer, clinging to the surface of the organ. And so we've seen that term a lot this year too, visceral and parietal. So again, this top layer is the fundus. The whole thing is going to be the body. The inner layer is the endometrium. The thickness is the myometrium, and the bottom is the cervix. The vagina is a thin-walled tube that provides the passageway for the delivery of the infant if it comes to full term, or the menstrual flow to leave the body. Sometimes this is called the birth canal. Usually that term is only used when we're getting ready to deliver the baby. It's about 3 to 4 inches in depth, in length, and it's between the bladder and the rectum. It goes from the cervix to the body's exterior. Its other role, obviously, is to receive the penis during sexual intercourse to try to get the sperm as close to the uterus as possible. Can't get into it, the cervix blocks it, and so the sperm have to work their way through that cervix. Distally, at the end of the vagina is an interior tube. The opening that can be seen would be considered the vaginal orifice. That end is covered in a membrane called the hymen. It's very vascular, and during first sexual intercourse, it may rupture or tear, and that can sometimes cause bleeding and can sometimes, for some people, be painful. Um, its durability varies, so it can be broken even if a woman has never had intercourse. So, certain sport activities, the insertion of a tampon sometimes, a pelvic exam by a gynecologist or the doctor, um, and various other situations uh, could result in it tearing even though the woman has not had intercourse. In other cases, even if she's had intercourse, it may not tear, and sometimes they have to actually surgically cut it. Okay, so kind of looking at the external structures here. The urethra is for urinating to the front, so the bladder is to the front. Then the vaginal opening or vaginal orifice is next. And then at the bottom, we have the anus. So back here would be the intestines. So the vagina is between the bladder and the intestines. And then that opening is covered partially with this mucus fold called the hymen. Now, as external genitalia, all of the external genitalia sometimes is referred to as the vulva. We have the clitoris, which can be enclosed in a prepuce or a fold of skin. The inner folds of skin have been pulled away so that we can see the exposed orifices, but normally they're not visible. The skin folds cover that, but in this case, for the diagram, they've moved them aside. So there's an inner fold which does not have hair. There's an outer fold, which at puberty often gets pubic hair. And then this area to the top, this would be the pubic bone right here. So this area over the top can get pubic hair also, and this area is called the mons pubis. So covering all those again, for external genitalia, we have the mons pubis. Literally, that means the mountain on the pubis. It's a little fatty deposit. Labia literally means lips. Not normally referred to this way, but you will see it in some places that literally the lips on your face also as part of the digestive system are called labia. So the outer and the inner would be called majora and minora, or major and minor. The clitoris, the urethral and vaginal orifices, and then there are some glands in this area also called vestibular glands, because this sort of entryway to those orifices is called a vestibule. And that term applies to other structures in the body as well. The mons pubis then is this fatty deposit on top of the pubic symphysis, and that can be covered in hair. So again, this would be the mons pubis, and that is sort of a secondary sex characteristic that develops. Okay, the inner folds and the outer folds are those labia and enclose the vestibule. And that is the region that has the urethral orifice, which is anterior, and the vaginal orifice, which is more posterior. And then the glands play a role in lubrication of the vagina, especially during intercourse. The clitoris is analogous to the end of the male's penis. So the glans penis, or that end of the penis, was covered in a foreskin or prepuce. Well, the clitoris is as well. It also can become engorged with blood and become erect. And it differs, though, from the penis, because in the penis, it has a reproductive duct in it. In other words, the urethra for the male tunnels through the penis. There's nothing like that for the clitoris. The only thing it has in common with it would be the nerve endings. Developmentally, as the body starts, the general plan is generic. And so it goes on to develop male or female characteristics, but some of those start from a similar developmental pattern. And we're going to see that in other notes. There's 2 videos at the end of the Google Slides here if you want to view them. One of them goes through all the stages of the ovarian follicles to explain those better, and we're going to be covering those in our next video as well.